A 72-year-old black man, once a decorated war veteran and respected judge, was pulled over on a quiet Sunday morning. The officer claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect. Minutes later, the man was handcuffed, humiliated in front of strangers, and thrown in the back of a squad car. But what the officer didn't know was that this man's past connections, courtroom experience, and unwavering dignity were about to turn the tables. And when the truth came out in court, the officer's career and his prejudice would be shattered. Before we dive into this gripping story of justice, redemption, and truth, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love powerful, soul-stirring stories that challenge the way we see the world, make sure you subscribe to Acts of Depth. The morning sun was barely breaking through the clouds when Judge Harold Whitaker stepped out of his modest two-story home on the east side of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He wasn't wearing a robe or sitting on a bench today. He had retired 7 years ago. This morning, he was just Harold. Just a man in a tan cardigan, his gray slacks pressed neatly, heading to pick up fresh bread from the bakery he'd been visiting every Sunday for decades. His neighbors waved as he walked toward his dark green 1998 Lincoln Town Car, a vehicle that looked as dignified and calm as the man who drove it. Inside, a gospel hymn played softly on the radio, his late wife's favorite. Harold was 2 blocks from the bakery when the flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe the officer was on his way to a call. But then came the short, sharp whoop of the siren, directed at him. Harold frowned. He was well within the speed limit. His registration and insurance were up to date. His turn signals worked. He hadn't even rolled through the last stop sign. Still, he eased the car to the side of the road. The officer who approached was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing dark sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. His name tag read S. Keller. His walk was slow, deliberate, the kind of pace meant to unsettle the person waiting in the driver's seat. Harold rolled down the window. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Keller's tone was clipped. "License and registration." Harold handed them over without argument, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Keller glanced at the documents but didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked over Harold's car, peering into the back seat as though expecting to find something suspicious. Finally, he said, "You match the description of a suspect from a robbery reported an hour ago. Older, black male, gray hair, dark sedan. That sound like you?" The phrasing wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Harold met his gaze. "I'm coming from my home, officer. I've been there all morning. You can check the street cameras if you like." Keller smirked. "We'll see about that. Step out of the vehicle." The tone was an order, not a request. Harold took a deep breath, remembering a lifetime of advising young men in his community on exactly what to do in moments like this. Stay calm, stay respectful, stay alive. He stepped out slowly, but before his feet were fully on the pavement, Keller grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and pressed him against the side of the car. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. "Officer, I believe this is unnecessary," Harold said evenly, though his voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the deep sting of indignity. A small crowd had begun to form on the sidewalk. Neighbors, passers-by, people pulling out their phones. Keller seemed to thrive under the attention. "You're being detained for questioning. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." But Harold knew better. He had spent decades in courtrooms watching how easily detained for questioning could become charged with resisting arrest, or worse. He said nothing more. Not yet. Because Harold also knew something Officer Keller didn't. Something that would change everything. Ethan stood frozen, the cool night air biting at his skin as Officer Grant's flashlight beam drilled into his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle," Grant ordered, his tone leaving no room for questions. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had done nothing wrong. No speeding, no broken tail light. He knew exactly why he was being stopped. "Is there a reason, officer?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice calm, even though his heart thumped like a drum. Grant smirked. "We'll get to that. Out. Now." Ethan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, careful not to make any sudden moves. He had been warned by his father since he was a teenager. Always keep your hands visible, speak clearly, don't argue. But no amount of preparation could erase the humiliation. Grant patted him down roughly. "You carrying anything? Weapons? Drugs?" "No, sir." Grant motioned to his partner, Officer Miller, who was standing back but clearly eager. "Check the trunk," Grant said. Ethan frowned. "You don't have probable cause." That was all Grant needed. He stepped forward, close enough for Ethan to feel his breath. "I smell marijuana," Grant lied flatly. "That's probable cause." The trunk was popped open without consent. Within seconds, Miller called out, "Well, look at this." Ethan turned, disbelief flooding his face. In Miller's hand was a small bag of white powder. "That's not mine," Ethan said immediately. "I've never—" Grant cut him off. "Save it for the judge." They slapped cuffs on him so tight his wrists burned. As they pushed him toward the cruiser, Ethan's mind spun. This wasn't just a false arrest. This was a setup. And if no one believed him, his life, his career, and his reputation would be over. From the shadows across the street, someone watched. Someone with a phone camera recording every second. But neither Grant nor Miller noticed. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that carried history and secrets. Marcus sat beside Evelyn, wearing the same calm expression he'd worn that night in the cell. But this time, his hands were free, resting on the table. The prosecutor painted a damning picture. They spoke of routine stops and clear evidence, leaning heavily on the small bag of powder that had been found in Marcus's car. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at Marcus with curiosity, others with quiet skepticism. When Officer Kent took the stand, he was composed, almost smug. He recounted his version of events with confidence, how Marcus had been nervous and evasive, how the search had been justified, and how the drugs had been discovered in plain view. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She let him talk, each lie carefully laid like a thread in a web he thought he controlled. When it was her turn, Evelyn rose with the grace of someone who'd been here before. She approached slowly, eyes locked on Kent. "Officer Kent," she began, voice calm but edged with steel. "You claim you pulled Mr. Holloway over because of erratic driving?" "Yes, ma'am," Kent replied. "Could you point to the section of your dash-cam footage that shows this erratic driving?" Kent's brow furrowed. The camera wasn't functioning that night. The courtroom stirred. Evelyn let the silence hang before asking, "Wasn't functioning, or was it turned off?" Kent shifted in his seat. "Malfunctioned." Evelyn stepped closer, holding up a file. "Funny thing, according to the department's own maintenance logs, your dash cam was tested and cleared that very morning. No issues. And yet, the footage for that night is missing. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Kent's jaw tightened. "I don't recall the specifics." Evelyn tilted her head, her voice soft but deadly. "Do you recall this?" She clicked a remote, and the projector flickered to life. The room gasped. It wasn't the dash cam. It was grainy cell phone footage from a bystander across the street. The clip showed Kent approaching Marcus's car, calm at first, until Marcus handed over his license. Kent's body stiffened, and then his voice became cold and clipped. Moments later, his hand slipped into his pocket before leaning into Marcus's car. The defense table stayed silent. The jury leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. "Tell me, Officer Kent," Evelyn asked, "what exactly were you placing in Mr. Holloway's vehicle?" Kent stammered. That's taken out of context." "No further questions," Evelyn said, turning her back to him. Marcus sat still, but inside, his heart pounded. This was the moment, the crack in the wall of lies. And Evelyn had just swung the hammer. The day of the trial arrived like the opening scene of a movie where everyone knew the stakes were bigger than just one man's fate. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters, their microphones like weapons, ready to capture every detail. Signs lined the streets, "Justice for Jamal," and "Stop the abuse of power." Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. On one side sat Officer Bradley Hayes, wearing a crisp uniform as if to remind everyone of his authority. His jaw was clenched, eyes darting with quiet arrogance. On the other side, Jamal Carter sat with his hands folded, wearing a simple suit his mother had bought him. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he looked calm. Calm in the way someone looks when they know the truth is finally about to breathe. Evelyn Monroe, the civil rights attorney with the poise of someone who had fought 100 battles in court, stood beside Jamal. Her eyes were steel. "Remember," she whispered, "we're not just telling your story today. We're telling everybody's story." The prosecution began with what they thought was an open and shut case. They displayed photographs of the so-called drugs found in Jamal's car and videos of Bradley pulling him over. The footage, carefully edited, showed only what the officer wanted the jury to see. Jamal looking nervous, Bradley following protocol. But then it was Evelyn's turn. She stood, her voice sharp yet calm, like a blade dipped in ice. "Your Honor, the defense will present a very different picture." She called Jamal to the stand. "Mr. Carter," she began, "tell the court what happened that night in your own words." Jamal's voice trembled at first, but then it grew steadier. "I was driving home from work. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. Officer Hayes pulled me over. He never told me why. He made me step out of my car and stand in the cold for 20 minutes. Then, out of nowhere, he found drugs in my glove compartment. Drugs I had never seen before in my life." Some jurors shifted in their seats. Evelyn let the words hang in the air before turning to her next move. "I'd like to call my next witness, Malcolm Rivers." Gasps rippled through the room as Malcolm walked in, a young black man, hands slightly shaking, wearing a worn jacket. Evelyn's voice softened. "Malcolm, tell the court what you told me." Malcolm took a deep breath. "A month before Jamal was arrested, Officer Hayes pulled me over too. He accused me of having drugs, but this time, he didn't find any. He let me go, but only after making threats." His voice cracked. "I didn't say anything back then because I was scared. But when I saw Jamal's face on the news, I knew I had to speak up." The prosecution objected, claiming it was irrelevant. The judge leaned forward. "Overruled. Continue." Evelyn then played footage, grainy but clear, from a traffic camera near the scene of Jamal's arrest. It showed Officer Hayes leaning into Jamal's car for several seconds before stepping back with the so-called evidence. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Bradley's confident smirk faded for the first time. Finally, Evelyn presented her last witness, Officer Daniel Whitmore, a former colleague of Bradley's who had resigned years earlier. He testified about a pattern in Bradley's stops, targeting young black men, sometimes without any probable cause. When the closing arguments came, Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom like a tide. This case is not just about Jamal Carter. It's about the abuse of power. It's about a man with a badge thinking he could rewrite the truth because he thought no one would challenge him. But the truth does not belong to him. It belongs to all of us. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear. We find the defendant guilty on all charges. Bradley's face drained of color. Jamal closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek, not of pain, but of release. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Jamal said only one thing. This wasn't just a win for me. This was a win for every person who's ever been silenced. The courtroom was packed. Activists, journalists, community members, and even off-duty officers filled the benches. The air buzzed with tension. For months, people had whispered about Officer Brad Holloway's questionable arrests, but whispers had never turned into proof. Today was different. Evelyn Monroe stood by Marcus, her presence radiating both calm and quiet fury. The defense table was covered with folders, digital evidence, and a thick binder labeled Operation Holloway. Marcus's hands trembled, but his eyes stayed locked forward. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had been humiliated, silenced, or falsely accused. When the judge entered, the crowd rose. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. The prosecution called their first witness, an internal affairs investigator. What followed was a calculated dismantling of Brad Holloway's career. Dashcam footage played on the giant screen. In one clip, Holloway could be heard making racially charged comments under his breath, unaware his mic was still recording. Then came Evelyn's ace card, a video from a small hardware store security camera. It showed the night Marcus was arrested. Brad's cruiser was parked behind the store. Holloway was seen exiting the vehicle, opening his trunk, and removing a small bag. Moments later, Marcus's car was pulled over, and the same bag mysteriously appeared on the hood. Gasps filled the courtroom. Brad's attorney objected, claiming the footage was circumstantial, but the judge allowed it. The store owner took the stand, confirming the date and authenticity of the footage. Then another bombshell dropped. Marcus wasn't Brad's first victim. 2 other men had been arrested in a nearly identical manner. One of them was still serving time. Evelyn's voice was steady as she addressed the jury in her closing argument. This case is about more than one man's freedom. It's about the freedom to exist without fear of being targeted because of the color of your skin. It's about the belief that justice should not depend on who wears the badge, but on truth. And today, you hold that truth in your hands. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear. We find the defendant, Officer Brad Holloway, guilty on all charges. The room erupted. Marcus felt his knees weaken, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming relief. Evelyn gripped his shoulder. Tears rolled down his face, not just for himself, but for the men who hadn't been so lucky. As Brad was led away in handcuffs, a reporter shouted, "Marcus, what's next for you?" Marcus glanced at Evelyn, then at the cameras. I'm going to fight, to make sure no one else has to go through this, and maybe, just maybe, I'll sleep tonight knowing we took a step towards something better. The day of the verdict arrived. The courthouse was packed. Journalists, activists, and regular townsfolk filled every seat. Some came for justice, others for spectacle. Outside, protesters chanted, holding signs that read, "Justice for Daniel Carter" and "End police racism now." Daniel sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. Beside him, Evelyn Monroe organized her closing notes. Her calm demeanor masked the storm inside her. She had fought many cases, but this one carried the weight of centuries of injustice. Officer Bradley sat across the room, straight-backed, but sweat clung to his forehead. His attorney whispered something to him, but Bradley's eyes kept darting toward the jury, as if he could sense the tide turning. Evelyn rose for the closing statement. Her voice was firm, carrying through the silence like a hymn. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just about Daniel Carter. This is about a man's dignity, a man's future, and the truth. Officer Bradley told you this was about public safety, but we've shown you this was about prejudice, plain and simple. We've shown the video, the reports, and the inconsistencies. And most importantly, you've seen Daniel, a man who has served his community, mentored its youth, and stood as a role model, despite every reason not to." She stepped closer to the jury, her gaze unwavering. "This is about more than law. It's about justice. When the law is used as a weapon against the innocent, we must hold those in power accountable. Today, you have that power." The courtroom was still. Even Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman rose, paper trembling in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bradley, guilty on all counts." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Daniel closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. Evelyn gripped his hand, firm, steady. Bradley's jaw dropped. The facade of control crumbled. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Daniel spoke briefly, his voice steady, despite the weight of it all. "This wasn't just my fight. This was for every person who's ever been stopped, searched, or shamed for the color of their skin. Justice doesn't erase the pain, but it gives us hope. And today, hope won." The crowd erupted in applause. Evelyn stood behind him, proud, knowing this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. But it mattered. That night, Daniel returned home to his quiet living room. He placed his police badge, the one he had worn decades earlier as a community officer, back on the shelf. It wasn't just a relic anymore. It was a reminder that even in a flawed system, truth could still stand. The courtroom was so quiet that Marcus could hear the ticking of the wall clock. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict slip with a trembling hand. Judge Whitmore's eyes scanned the room before nodding. "In the case of the state versus Marcus Lee, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all counts." Gasps filled the room. Marcus's knees almost buckled. For weeks, he had braced himself for the possibility of years behind bars for a crime he never committed. Across the room, Officer Trent's jaw tightened, his pale knuckles gripping the table. The truth had finally been laid bare. The body cam footage Evelyn Monroe uncovered, showing Trent slipping the drugs into Marcus's glove compartment, had been the nail in the coffin. But Marcus didn't gloat. He just looked at Trent, not with hatred, but with something unexpected: pity. Here was a man so consumed by prejudice and power that he'd nearly destroyed another life, and in the end, he'd destroyed his own. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs went off. A young boy pushed through the crowd, Marcus's son, Caleb, throwing his arms around his father's waist. "You're coming home, Dad," he whispered. Marcus's throat tightened. Evelyn stood beside them, her eyes fierce but soft. "Justice isn't just about winning in court," she said quietly. "It's about showing the world the truth, even when it's ugly." And for the first time in months, Marcus smiled. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew that what happened here today might save the next man from going through the same nightmare. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that almost hums in your ears. Everyone was holding their breath as Judge Hernandez prepared to speak. Marcus sat between his lawyers, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across the room, Officer Kane stared straight ahead, jaw locked, but the nervous twitch in his eye betrayed the storm raging inside him. The judge's voice was firm but deliberate. "The evidence presented leaves no doubt in this court's mind. Officer Kane, you abused your authority, falsified reports, and attempted to destroy the life of an innocent man. This is not just a violation of law. It is a betrayal of the public trust." Gasps filled the room. Some scribes from local newspapers quickly began typing, sensing this would be front-page news. Judge Hernandez continued, "I hereby sentence you to 7 years in state prison, followed by a lifetime ban from law enforcement." Kane's head dropped. For the first time, his face showed something other than arrogance. Shame. Marcus's chest tightened. He thought victory would feel sweeter, but as he looked at Kane, he saw not just a corrupt cop, but a broken man who had lived in hate so long he couldn't see the humanity in others. After court adjourned, Evelyn Monroe walked up to Marcus. "Justice isn't just about winning, Marcus," she said softly. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did." Outside, the crowd cheered as Marcus stepped into the sunlight. He had his freedom, his dignity, and, thanks to Evelyn and her team, the truth had been laid bare for the world to see. Reporters swarmed, asking how he felt. Marcus paused, looking into the cameras. "This isn't just my victory," he said. "It's for every person who's been silenced, doubted, or framed because of the color of their skin. Today, we proved that truth can win, if we're brave enough to fight for it." Months later, Marcus started a foundation to help others wrongfully accused. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Evelyn stood beside him, smiling proudly. "You didn't just survive, Marcus," she told him. "You transformed, and that's the real victory." The hidden struggle had become a public triumph. Moral justice had prevailed, and in the quiet strength of a man who refused to be broken, the world saw what redemption truly looked like.